Welcome back. We're the Book Mavens. You're joining us for Fae May. Woo. And Rachel very graciously and beautifully did her solo video last week because that's my bad. But we're back. And just to give you a heads up for like kind of how Fae May is going to go, we're really focusing on the work of Sarah J. Maas. Or Maas? We're not sure. Sarah Janet?
Sarah Janet.
Who is,
I still love that.
That's what Jess Owens calls her, and she's our favorite. So, yeah, we're going to talk about Sarah's works. So, each week in the coming weeks, because honestly, those are the most popular Fae books out there right now, realistically. If you talk about Fae, and they're going to talk about either the Throne of Glass series, or more likely the Court of Thorns and Rose series, or her new Crescent City. So, what we're going to do is, because we've actually read all of them, we're going to spend a video a week talking about each series. So, like today, we're going to be talking about a court. Nope.
We're gonna be talking about Throne of Glass.
Yeah, today we're going to be talking about Throne of Glass, and then next week we'll talk through the Court of Thorns and Roses series, and then the Crescent City series, the two that are out so far, and then at the end we're going to do a Maas versus Maas, and compare what we think and where we think it's going, because there's some interesting things.
Yeah. So we have a closed series, and then we have two still running series.
Yeah.
So it's definitely going to be interesting. There are certainly, if anybody who's watching is a Maas fan, you know that, of course, that there are some majorly interesting conversations happening about where two of these series are going to go. So,
But more on that later.
Yes.
Stay tuned through May.
Stay tuned.
So today we're going to be focusing on the Throne of Glass series, which she first published in 2012 and then ran up until 2018. I looked it up. August 2012, Throne of Glass was printed, and then the last book, Kingdom of Ash, came out in October of 2018. So there are in total 8 books and then a novella. Right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. No, sorry. 7 and then 8 with the short story series.
Assassin Split, yeah.
Okay, so Rachel read these as they came out.
I did.
I read them
because of me.
That's true. I read them kind of broken up. I read A Court of Thorns and Roses first, whipped through it over holiday break. It was great. And then I started and then I started Throne of Glass. And then had to pause because of our Summer of Hobbs challenge. It's just too many. There's just too many things. I couldn't keep up. I just couldn't do it.
We flew through those hot books, and those were some big ones.
So then I was finally able to go back and finish A Throne of Glass. If you saw our holiday TBR, that was my holiday focus, was finishing that series. And I freaking loved it. It was amazing. So we had a kind of a different experience, because you would have to like read and then wait. And then I was just able to go as quickly as I wanted, because I didn't come to the series until like 2020. So she was completely done. It is the most expansive of her series so far. It has the most characters. It's like a multi-character perspective. It is her longest series so far.
Well, this is a third-person perspective, which is different than what we get with ACOTAR or A Court of Thorns and Roses, where it's first-person perspective for the first 3 books. So it is different. It is more expansive. You certainly spend more time with other characters compared with A Court of Thorns and Roses.
I think you very aptly described it as well, that Throne of Glass is it's very plot driven and the romance is secondary, while A Court of Thorns and Roses, which I think people are more familiar with right now, is very romance driven, and then like the political plot is the subplot kind of thing. So, but gosh, I loved it. So it starts with her name changes kind of halfway through, which listen, if you've not read it and you're watching this video, at your own peril, we're going to talk about the whole thing and intertwine. So if you don't,
we have to get into like really particular spoilers, but I think most people understand that I mean, we're following somebody who is set up as an assassin, going by a name, and then we find out her true name.
Selena.
Yeah, we found out her true name, I think, at the end of the second one.
Yeah, Selena Sardothian, which is a great name. The names in this are so good. Ardalon, Rifthold is the name of the place they're in. Arabin. He's the worst.
He is the worst.
Okay, so it starts with she's in this slave camp. So basically the whole first, I love these books so much. It starts with she's in this like slave camp. So then she gets pulled to compete to be the king's champion. So the whole first book is about her competing to to basically get this pardon and to become the king's assassin.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like a full-on Hunger Games kind of thing to win. And then in the second book, she has one, and so then it's about her role trying to navigate within the court and be an assassin, but also she doesn't really want to be an assassin anymore. And she's like dealing with all her own stuff. And then
it explodes, and you're going to see that the first 2 books are a very different tone than what we see when we pick up, like, so we start with Throne of Glass and then Crown of Midnight, and then we hit Heir of Fire. And with Heir of Fire, the length goes up, the story becomes more complex, becomes larger. We're in a different land. We switch perspectives. It just becomes so much more expansive. But if you are familiar with Sarah J. Maas's writing, where she particularly shines, and I think how she writes trauma is done very well. And she writes it very well in this. She writes it probably just as well, if not better, if we're looking at the second book of the ACOTAR series. And in Crescent City, all 3 of her series do focus on trauma, overcoming trauma,
healing,
and what that looks like, and kind of being in these characters' heads with them as they go through it. Sarah J. Maas people are very divisive about her. People love her, like almost on like a rabid level, and then people just really hate her. And I think that every author definitely has places in which they can improve. And there are things that just hit just right. And the big thing that I think people need to give Sarah J. Maas credit for is that she brought a ton of people back to reading who hadn't been reading in a long time. So even if we can say that, her plots can be weak, it can be uneven, does she need to edit some of her books so they're too long? Yes, you can absolutely make those criticisms. Those are fair. But don't forget that Girlfriend still writes compelling stories.
Right.
She writes characters that people want to follow along with. Are we always happy where they go? No. But that's life. You get to the ACOTAR video next week, because I got feelings. Yeah. But I think it's also important, though, to say that Sarah J. Maas wrote Throne of Glass while she was in high school. And I think when people talk about an uneven tone with the Throne of Glass series, is that the first couple of books come at you from a very young, immature perspective, which actually fits Selena quite well. And you just see that character mature and have to face bigger decisions and life-altering decisions and decisions you can't go back on. And that's very real for people moving from adolescence into adulthood. So, like I said, there are valid criticisms for her storytelling, but I think the stories that she's telling are compelling. And if you're looking at this also from just somebody who is in their teens and moving into adulthood, these are so incredibly relevant and impressive that she wrote this.
Yeah, let me tell you what I wrote in high school. Not anything like that.
Yeah. So I mean, you gotta give her
credit where credit's due, guys. Any author who manages to complete something like this and publish honestly deserves our respect, because this takes a lot, and it takes a lot out of a person, and then to put yourself out there like that, like even in books we didn't like, right? Like, go back and watch 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. We really struggled with that book. But I take a lot of respect for somebody to attempt something that complex. I mean, it didn't do it for me. But also, kudos to you. Like, it's hard. It's hard. And obviously, it is hard, or we would all be doing it. I'm saying. Little credit where credit's due. But no, I think you're right. And honestly, this is my... I love this series so much. It's so good. I recommend it to everybody. And like, because everybody right now is on, like, all of my friend groups, they're all on the ACOTAR train. And I'm like, yeah, but have you read Throne of Glass? And they're like, oh, it just seems like so much. And I'm like, it's really not, because this one's already at 4 or 3 in the novella, really. Come on, guys, you can do it.
You can do it.
If you read Harry Potter, you can do this. Okay, so let's talk about...
Are we talking about some basic overlaying plot?
Oh, I want to talk about characters.
Okay.
Okay. Selena, I will admit, as soon as I started reading this book, I was like, I see why Rachel likes me so much. She's like,
Maas.
She's good. She writes a strong female character.
In Throne of Glass in particular. I think her strongest characters come out of Throne of Glass. I will die on that hill. I don't care who you are.
And I'll back you up.
I think that her strongest character and strongest character development happened in Throne of Glass. It just is. And because you're dealing with so many characters, you're going from a story that's actually pretty small in scale to something that is like Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, epic size. It grows, it expands, and you get a plethora of characters that are added in, but they're all well-developed characters. Like, you never feel particularly lost with all of them. They all serve an important purpose.
I never felt like there were any
She
loose
shines
ends,
the last
really.
3 books of this series.
Yeah,
for sure.
Sometimes, with expansive books, like a thread can get lost, or like something just never gets satisfied. That even happens on TV. If you watch the series Lost, I still don't understand what the point of those polar bears was in season 1.
Well,
what was the point?
We can make that criticism later for the second Crescent City book. That conversation will happen later.
In this series,
Maas doesn't drop the ball.
Which is important considering how expansive it is and how well-developed the characters are. You really do care and want to know what happens to the characters. And so the fact that she's still able to bring all the pieces back together and resolve it in a way that feels authentic to the story. Sometimes the resolutions seem very like sped through or convenient. If you remember the epilogue of the Hunger Games, a lot of people had criticism for it because it just felt like so like fast and like you just moved, and kind of the same for the the final Harry Potter epilogue where like fast forwards in time. A lot of people had criticism for that because they loved it so much and then it just felt very fast and rushed. You don't feel that way with this series. I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed each step of the journey. I enjoyed each group of new characters. I loved all the little side stories. Like, she's a powerhouse main character. And at first she's kind of gray. Because you're like, she's
kind of annoying.
She's kind of annoying because she's
very, a teenager.
She's swaggery with good reason. Like, she's very skilled. she is an assassin. So, there's that whole moral gray. How much, it's kind of gray because how much choice did she have? But also, she killed people.
Well, you also hear people criticize this first book in terms of where she tends to plot out things that she could do, but then doesn't follow through on those things. But I think the more you live with Selena, you realize that she doesn't necessarily want to be an assassin. It's a cover, and it's this lifestyle that she was forced into in order for her to survive. But that doesn't necessarily make her a cold-blooded killer. And so just because she's capable of it doesn't mean she has to deliver every time she's contemplating escaping a situation. And I think a lot of people just I've seen a reviewer talk about that, and I'm not going to name names, but
you can tell me later.
I'll tell you later. That I rolled my eyes. I'm like, okay, so this is somebody who, number one, only read the first book, and so didn't see her develop. And I understand people don't want to commit to books where they feel like the story is not going to get good until so much later. That's a big time commitment. But this is still a good book. It's still a good story. Does it become more high fantasy and more complex in the later books? Absolutely. But you can also make the same comparison to Harry Potter.
Yes,
exactly. You are growing with the character. It's becoming more of a complex story. It just doesn't start off at that height. It grows, and you need to be willing and able to be part of that journey.
Well, but I'll say this even too, it is a complete book. It is the story of the King's Assassin Championship, right? And there is a resolution to that arc at the end. It's not like they left you on this huge cliffhanger and you're like, oh, I don't know if I should. They completed the story. There was just so much more of it to tell. Yeah. Which, oh my gosh, and then those characters get so interesting.
Well, also something Sarah J. Maas does that people are always like, well, she does it very well in ACOTAR, but she does it in this, and the fact that you have a main character, and she always has female main characters, that they don't end up with their first romantic interest. And what's really interesting about...
I was shipping it hard, guys, too.
Selena.
Both times. I was all in. And then by the time she flipped the switch, I was like, oh my gosh, wait a minute. Am I cheering for this? Hold on a second. I felt very disloyal.
So some people, they do comment that she's one that kind of makes you fall in love with one, and then it ends up with that they don't stay together. And I like that she does that. It's something a little bit more unique in the kind of romantasy genre, so to speak, subgenre, that she does that it's not just this one and done kind of situation, because that doesn't mirror real life for a lot of people. And I really respect that. Now, that being said, she did not publish Assassin's Blade, which is her series of novellas that she published together into one volume, until later on.
In 2014, the same year she did Air of Fire. I did research this, so guys.
You find out things about her past, because she's 19 at the start. That's where I think 19? She's 17?
She's
a teen.
She's 19 when the book starts.
Okay, so there we go.
But the Assassin's Blades go way back. Now, I want to say the best piece of advice I got from this is that it was recommended to me to read Assassin's Blade, the series of short stories, right after Heir of Fire, right?
So I disagree with that.
But here's why it worked out so well for me. Okay, so Heir of Fire is where she leaves Rifthold and goes to start to kind of claim her bigger destiny, right? This is where we really start to widen out. You find out she is actually, the heir to this lost kingdom. Like, there's a lot more to her character and her backstory and her history that, did she know? She's discovering, and she goes to train with the Fae, okay?
Yeah, we think of her as human until the end of the second book.
But now knowing that there's this bigger thing, and then I read this.
Spoilers.
Yeah. You can get that from the back of the books, guys. I said at your own peril. This is it. So then by reading those short stories, they were fresh enough in my mind when they really started to come into play in the next books. Because the next book is Queen of Shadows, and this is where she's starting to go gather allies. And so some of the characters from those short stories really came into play. But here's the thing. I had already learned in the earlier books about the trauma and the lack of choices that had her become an assassin. So then to see these things that she kind of casually references or thinks about in more detail was really, I think, it just worked for me as a reader. And I think I really enjoyed it. I think if I had read that absolutely first, I would not have been as interested in her character. I kind of liked that we get dropped at the end. Like, she's already been captured. She's in this camp. And then you're learning things about her. And then you go back to these short stories and fill in these gaps in a way that keeps those stories fresh for when they become relevant in the later books. Because they're not really relevant until you get to Empire of Storms, maybe a little bit in Queen of Shadows, some of the later books. So if I read them too early, I worried that I would have forgotten.
Definitely Empire of Storms, for sure.
Yeah, I worried that I would have forgotten
Kingdom of Ash, the last book. Well, a particular story in Assassin's Blade, though, with her relationship with Sam Cortland. I wish I had at least had read that novella before I read Throne of Glass. The other ones, absolutely, you could have waited until the third, but because of that trauma, being somebody who's very closed off, that she had this relationship with somebody where she was emotionally vulnerable, and then to suffer such a tragedy really shapes how she behaves with Kale, who is a love interest of hers in the first couple of books, that is very relevant. And then you see it becomes so much more meaningful later on, she visits his grave and lays a stone down. Those things become very significant to me, knowing that backstory. And see, for me, but I think I didn't read Assassin's Blade though until I finished the series. I think that's what made the story more meaningful for me though when I read Assassin's Blade, is because I knew what an important part of her life he had been, and trying to understand how that had come to be. I don't know. I just think I would have had more patience for her as a character, knowing that trauma, reading that trauma before hitting Throne of Glass, before reading the first one. Where I think that for people who were so intolerant of her in terms of why she displays elements of selfishness, why she puts up this front, that you can see this is all armor because she's an incredibly vulnerable person. Highly traumatized. Yes. And so I think, and with Arabin, I think that those stories were important. And I wish that I'd had it. I mean, I was there for the ride. I enjoyed it. But I think that those particular stories, now when she's in the desert and when she, those could come later because those are more adventurous. But those are character building for me, that I wish I had read those first. But that's so choose your adventure. I don't think you're gonna make a wrong choice. no, you definitely won't. Yeah, I think you could go either way, and kind of it's more what you want to do. But I did like them. I mean, they're not because they're kind of prequel-y, so they're not moving the major plot on, but they really just give her another layer of depth to the main character, which is so. And she is an onion. She is an onion. Like Shrek. And you keep peeling it back and she is. She's a well-developed character, and people tend to have an interesting relationship with Aelin. She is not actually my favorite character of the book, but her character, everything that happens to her moves the plot forward. It's very important, and how it centralizes on her makes sense. But my favorite character, you don't see until, what is it, the third book? Second book.
She comes in. I wrote it down for you.
I always forget.
She comes in, yes, in Air of Fire in the third book.
one. Air of Fire is one of my favorites. I do like that one because you see Selena, who we find out her true name is Aelin, that she starts developing a relationship with Rowan, and that's her primary love interest for the rest of the story. And Rowan is definitely, he is my favorite.
He's complex.
Mass man. He's my favorite, hands down. He just is. And
once
again, another hill I will die on. But you get introduced to a witch, and her name is Manon, and she is my favorite Maas character. And I have some close ones, specifically in this series. Alid is another character that you get introduced to later on, who's fabulous, whose story runs alongside Manon's for quite a bit. She's amazing.
I love Alid and Lorcan.
Yeah, their story is very good.
Very good. Honestly, the whole story so Rowan is part of a cadre who is sworn to basically one of the villains.
Yeah,
Maeve.
there's a fairy queen.
Oh my gosh, she's absolutely insane.
Yeah.
So Maeve is like...
She's a very well-developed villain.
Very well-developed villain. And so that whole group of Fae, I find really interesting in the way that they tie in, with Aileen, with Adian, with Alid. I really like their story. But my favorite character is Abraxas.
Well, Abraxas goes hand in hand with Manon.
That's true.
We do get some animals. She has a little dog named Fleetfoot. That's very cute in the first couple of books.
Yeah, the Rooks later.
The Rooks later in Tower of Dawn.
Oh, that's another one. I love
Tower of Dawn was very good.
And Nesreen. Their story is
I didn't care about their story. I did like the big birds, though.
I love their story. They're like one of my favorites.
Urine's a great character as well. We do have kind of this standout book where you're not with Aelin, our main character. You follow Kale, who's a human, and he's going to try and gather more support for what's happening.
Healed.
Right, and he suffers a horrible traumatic injury, and so he's also seeking. It's a whole big thing. But
that will come up later because when we go into ACOTAR, you can see what she can do with the journey to personal forgiveness and acceptance in Tower of Dawn. That is like her masterclass in how you learn to live with yourself and how you learn to forgive yourself.
Also with Crescent City, when you talk about House of Earth and Blood, the first one, she writes trauma very well in that, and living with decisions you made and having to come to terms with those things and face those. She does this very well. She, in our opinion, does not deliver as well in A Court of Silver Flames, but we'll talk about that later.
We'll talk about that in the next video, but just know that it's coming.
It's coming.
But Tower of Dawn shows you what you really. Now, I will mind you, that is the next to last book, so you're like in it, and it leaves you on a cliffhanger, and then you're like, let's go to this whole world, and you're like, no,
ends on a horrible cliffhanger, and you're like,
I can't. Yeah. But you need to.
Yeah.
But you don't want to.
You don't want. Yeah. You can't skip it. You can't skip.
You can't. It's so good. It actually has ended up being one of my favorites.
Yeah.
And I would not have predicted that at all. But the animal characters are always the best. My favorite team is the Abraxas. They're having this very.
Well, we haven't experienced what Abraxas is.
Oh, okay.
Abraxas is a wyvern, so like a dragon, a dragon-esque creature. So and,
I picture
Toothless from How to Train Your Dragon. People make that comparison.
Yeah, that's how he's described. Mm-hmm. So I kind of think of it as like a cross between a hippogriff and a dragon, like in my mind, like big, bulky, like a hippogriff, but also kind of sleek like a dragon because they ride them.
They do, but I don't think them is quite as large as like a classic European dragon size. Smaller, more. That's where I think like Toothless comes into it, but bigger than Toothless.
It's a
sport model.
It's a sport model
dragon.
But he's like the most. His whole story, he's amazing. And how she comes to pick him and like how tough and resilient he is. You freaking love him, but he's also, he infuriates her so much. Manon is like, she is the wing leader. She's like the battle general, like she has leader of the
commanding force, the 13, and like the elite.
So they are having this, her and one of her 13 are having this huge plot moment, this huge reveal. It is incredibly traumatic. It is incredibly heart-rending. And then Abraxas, she like looks over and Abraxas is like rolling in the flowers, just like having the time of his life. And you can feel her eye roll. You can feel her eye roll. It is so, you can just imagine her whole head moving with it. Because he infuriates her because he's kind of, they're like, your women's being weird. And she's like, whatever. There's one of my kids, she's like, you are embarrassing me. Stop. Because he's like a giant, like, joyful puppy, which is he shouldn't be. He has a very traumatic,
he's small compared to other Wyverns.
He's kind of written off.
But she sees something in him. And there's a connection there.
Loyal.
And
he's got so much personality. I just love him. Which is, I think, why I like the Rooks too, because the Rooks show a lot of personality and a lot of bonding with their
a good
writers.
Animal sidekick. Yeah. All about that.
I'm telling you, so Brax is my favorite, although Rowan's my
favorite.
I think aside from Abraxas,
I like him more than Rhysand. I like him more than Cassian, Azriel. He's at the top in terms of mass men. I do. And I know that the storyline people have issues. Once again, I mentioned this in our Fae May intro video about how people are about humanizing Fae. They're not human. I'm tired of Fae being talked about. I mean, a lot of it as just having pointy ears and.
No, they're supposed to be more animalistic, like have more
larger
like,
than average is how some people describe it, which is kind of funny. But like, and just big, beautiful men. That's not. Yeah, it's the animalistic quality.
A lot of them can like actually shapeshift.
Yeah,
there's two of them in the cadre that shapeshift. Mm-hmm. Like they're meant to be more.
They're different.
Elemental, I guess.
Yes.
They're meant to be more elemental beings.
And they're immortal. Right. I think they set aside a lot of these things that we deem to be very human qualities. People need to let that go. People also need to realize that you're living in a fantasy world that's written on the page. I get real tired. I'm ranting a little bit, but I get real tired of people criticizing works of fiction. These aren't real people. On the page, me as a reader, I can feel very safe in my position as a reader to read something exciting about characters who aren't real and who can work it out because we're in their heads. We can see what they're doing. We can see the repercussions of their actions and why they're doing what they're doing, what motivates them. It's different. These relationships are not something that I would want to see modeled in the real life.
Oh,
but in these settings,
absolutely not. But
in this world,
I'm here for it.
I'm tired of people saying that these relationships are problematic. If you want a real life example, then stick with the contemporary romantic fiction where people try really hard to mimic what real relationships are. You shouldn't be seeking that in fantasy novels. They're fantasy.
Like, I'm gonna get that made as a teacher. Fantasy.
It's just that because there's an element of danger. Well, we can safely sit in our little hooded blankets with our tea or whatever it is that we're drinking, and exist in our minds in these worlds. People need to let it go. Be like Elsa and let it go. Let it go. That should not be the hang up for a fantasy book. Okay, rant over.
But here's my thing. Honestly, even then, like, I like their relationship. I like that they are healing their own individual trauma.
Oh yeah, the trauma is always great.
I like that they're growing together.
Well, people don't like it because Rowan beats her, but he's training her. She is someone who absolutely can take that level of physicality, who has grown up with that level of physicality. This is not new. And I'm sorry, she is not a 21st century human. She's not what we're talking about. The relationship is different.
Surprise.
So, let it go.
Let it go, guys.
Let it go.
Also, you can follow Dorian. You can follow Kale if you want the human
Dorian.
Dorian? What? Okay.
Dorian's a prince. He starts off this kind of smarmy,
very kind of
prince.
Here's my thing.
Spoiled.
You think he's very spoiled and selfish, but then you find that all of that is a cover.
Of course.
Right? Like, he very quickly gets way deeper. And then how he survives is
enormous trauma. I just love his interactions with Manon. Once again, my girl.
My gosh.
I love it. And not to be too spoilery, but in terms of how the book ends in relation to those two characters, perfection.
That's how Rachel feels.
I do. I think that's perfect. That's exactly for those characters. For him to accept her for what she is beautiful. And for her to understand that he understands her and respects her
Is huge for her.
Is huge. And for her choices and for her responsibilities and what they can give to each other or not give to each other, it is done extremely well. And
I think that's
people who want like a continuing story need to stop.
No,
Stop.
sometimes, guys, it's perfect just to leave it. Just leave it. That one is perfect. Just leave it.
It ends very
You need
well.
that one to just...
It's wrapped up. It's so great.
I love it. I liked it. And Manon was hard. Like, that's not usually a character that I'm usually into. Like, I'm not like
She starts off incredibly gray. And I mean dark
gray. Like, yeah, you're like, there's just enough in there for it to be gray. But then she's like, it's her own evolution too. Again, it's that master class of evolving as a person. And Manon becomes so fascinating while she really battles the like traditional values of the covens and that system.
She really is.
And then learning more about herself and learning more about the enemy, the people she thought were her enemies this whole time. Like, and really coming to her own and really learning.
And learning from her 13, learning from her people who are there to support her in everything she does, and for them to be the ones to open her eyes to so many things,
I love the
so
13.
many wrongs that are happening. And for her, and Manon shines when you don't really know. She's one of the more unpredictable characters because you never know what she's going to do when confronted with new pieces of information and how she's going to respond. And it is wonderful.
Yeah.
Her evolution is fascinating. She keeps things very kind of close to her chest. She doesn't really share. So you're waiting to see what she's going to do. She's a very well-written, unpredictable character. And I love it. And I sobbed.
Oh.
The third book, or sorry, the last book, Kingdom of Ash. There is something that happens.
You know what we're talking about.
That broke me.
I had to take a break. I had to take a break.
I was very emotionally
I need a minute because it was too much. You know what I think?
What happens with some of those characters?
Another thing I really like about this series is that, you're right. Like, Aileen is not, I think, the people's favorite character that they pull out of this series.
She's somebody who has to do what she needs to do, and that journey isn't always comfortable. And having to make decisions you wouldn't want to make. So sometimes it's uncomfortable being with Aelin.
But here's the other thing though that I like because she's a central character and we're kind of going around her and all this expanded. I like that it highlights that not all relationships are always meant for all the time. Yeah. Like there is in the first books, like, we talked about, there is a romantic interest in the beginning that you're kind of rooting for and then it switches. But even that, like the friendships, like with Lysandra or Lysandra with Evangeline or her relationship with Aedion, like
forgiveness is something that's very explored.
And then it's fine if people fade in and out of your life. Like some people are in your life for a time and it's very valuable and you treasure it deeply. And then, life happens. You move apart. I thought they did that really well.
Relationships change and evolve.
You're changing. So your relationships change. And I think they did that really well because I think sometimes we cling to things because we think we should or we think because that's how it used to be. And that's just not life. I think that's an important human experience element that is done really well in these books is that natural evolution of relationships.
Yeah, I think so too. There are things that she writes in here about the experiences of some of these characters that you're living with them, particularly in the end of Empire of Storms and then heading into Kingdom of Ash and living with this character through tremendous physical it's torture but like what it is, you feel it. Like I was physically uncomfortable, not like in a way that I was disturbed, but what she's experiencing, I felt like I was in there with her and what that would be like, and the claustrophobia and those feelings of being trapped and the feelings of panic and being frenzied. You're there. And Maas, those scenes that she writes
powerful
are very masterful.
You can not like her story all you want, but you can't. The girl can write.
She can, and so that's why I have very little tolerance.
Sometimes does she need an editor and all that stuff? Sure,
yeah, but it's not in this series. It's not. It's Throne of Glass is her strongest writing. Her strongest writing is in the series. It just is. And I think people are intimidated by the length of how many books there are.
But don't. Guys,
Don't.
you read Harry Potter. You went on the Summer of Hob with us.
Mm-hmm.
Come on. You can do it.
And they're not as, I mean, to me, they're not as dense as something like Hob.
They're not Hob, guys.
No.
Like, you can do this. You can do it.
These
you can
are
do
very
this and
readable.
work.
Yeah.
I was going to say, so you're like, oh, I don't want to get about. No, you can do this.
I mean, there are certainly books that I like more than others. I like the first book. It's not my favorite out of the series. I do think the weakest is the second book. The second book to me is the weakest.
I would agree with that.
I think that
but
there
it's still
are...
an important book.
It's still important. There are big reveals that happen, but to me, it is the one
It's
that
the
is...
last 3.
It would be the one I would put on the bottom of the stack in terms of just overall readability and enjoyment. I felt like that was just... You know, but then when you're talking about a series, even with something like Harry Potter, which every book is bringing something to the table, people have their favorites and they have ones that they put in the end. They're like, well, you know, if I'm going to have to rank them, that's going to be the one at the bottom. You know what I mean? And I'm not trying to compare it to the phenomena that Harry Potter was, but these are still very good books.
Read them.
I recommend them. If you're going to read any Sarah J. Maas,
these are the ones.
This is the series you need to read.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Oh, yeah.
If you're looking for great plot development, if you're looking for elements of romance, but romance being secondary to an overall plot, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And they start off YA to me, and definitely like the first book is very YA, and then heading into new adult, and then I really feel like the last 3 books are pretty adult.
Those are very adult books. I would agree. I would not recommend those for because they're very
like 14-year-olds.
It's very
but if you're
themes. If you're
if you're a proficient reader at 17, 18, I would say sure, go for it. Yeah. But not for
it's
new
intense
teens.
themes. I wouldn't. So thanks for joining us on our discussion of the Throne of Glass series. We definitely think you should read it. Next week we'll be discussing the A Court of Thorns and Roses series, which is also by Sarah J. Maas. It's her more romance forward series, and it's also the one that I think I would argue is the most popular right now. We definitely have some feelings about it, so we hope you'll join us next week. Let us know in the comments, have you read A Throne of Glass? Who's your favorite character? Do you agree with us about some of our points? Let us know. We hope to talk to you there. See you next time. Bye.
Bye.